The sand dunes of Egypt held their secret for almost 2,000 years. In 1978, local peasants, hunting for antiquities in caves near the city of El Minya, discovered a leather binding with papyrus sheets darkened by time. They did not suspect that they held in their hands a document capable of overturning the understanding of early Christianity. The manuscript was sold to an antiquities dealer who kept it in a bank safe in New York, unaware of the true value of the find. For almost 30 years, the text passed from hand to hand on the black market for antiquities, until in the early 2000s, it came into the possession of scholars from National Geographic. When Coptic language specialists began translating, they could not believe their eyes. Before them lay the legendary Gospel of Judas, a text whose existence was known only through mentions in the works of early Christian theologians who condemned it as heretical. "It's like finding a lost Shakespeare play," one of the researchers uttered, when the first translated lines revealed to the world a completely different image of the apostle traitor. In the four canonical Gospels, the image of Judas Iscariot is painted with ruthless, harsh strokes. Of all 12 apostles, only he remains in humanity's memory as a symbol of absolute betrayal. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, despite differences in details, are unanimous on the main point. Judas betrayed his teacher for 30 pieces of silver. Matthew recounts how Judas himself came to the chief priests with an offer. "What will you give me, and I will deliver him to you?" Mark and Luke emphasize that Satan entered Judas. John adds that Judas was a thief who stole from the disciples' common purse. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal is sealed with a kiss, a gesture that for 2 millennia has become a universal symbol of perfidy. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." These words forever define Judas's fate in human culture. The end of the story is also known to every Christian. Tormented by remorse, Judas returns the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and hangs himself. The Acts of the Apostles adds an even darker detail. Judas's body falls. He burst open in the middle, and all his intestines gushed out. For 2 millennia, this story has shaped Western consciousness. Dante placed Judas in the lowest circle of hell, where Lucifer himself eternally chews the betrayer in one of his 3 mouths. Artists from Giotto to Caravaggio depicted the moment of betrayal as the culmination of human fall. The name Judas became a common noun, synonymous with betrayal in dozens of languages worldwide. But what if this commonly accepted story is only one side of the coin? What if the canonical Gospels, written decades after the described events, reflect only the victorious version of a complex theological struggle in the early centuries of Christianity? The 2nd and 3rd centuries CE were a time of rapid development for Christianity. After the death of the apostles, their followers spread throughout the Roman Empire, carrying the teachings of Christ to the most remote corners. But along with the spread of the faith, the diversity of its interpretations also grew. Christianity at that time was not a single church, but a multitude of communities, with varying understandings of the nature of Christ, the meaning of his sacrifice, and the path to salvation. In Alexandria, the largest intellectual center of the ancient world, Christianity acquired a philosophical tint, absorbing elements of Platonism. In Syria and Asia Minor, communities formed that gravitated toward the Jewish roots of the teaching. In Rome, a more hierarchical model of the church was taking shape. Each direction had its own sacred texts, Gospels, epistles, revelations. Historians count more than 50 different Gospels circulating among early Christians. Beyond the texts we know from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there were the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Truth, and many others. Each text reflected a particular understanding of Christ's teaching. The Gospel of Judas was one such alternative text, but its fate turned out to be particularly tragic. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, in his work Against Heresies, written around 180 CE, first mentions this text, calling it a fabrication of a group of Cainite heretics who exalt Cain, the Sodomites, and Judas, saying that only they possess true knowledge. Why did church hierarchs fight so fiercely against alternative gospels? The fact is that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a critically important process was underway. The formation of the canon, that is, the officially recognized set of sacred texts. This process was inextricably linked with the struggle for power and influence within the growing Christian movement. As Christianity became an increasingly organized religion, there arose a need for uniformity of doctrine. Bishops of major cities, especially Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, sought to establish control over scattered communities. The unification of sacred texts became the most important tool of this control. A decisive turning point occurred in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine, who had embraced Christianity, convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Although the council predominantly discussed questions about the nature of Christ, this event marked a symbolic moment when one direction of Christianity, that which we today call orthodox or canonical, received state support and began to suppress alternative currents. In this atmosphere of struggle for uniformity of faith, texts that contradicted the emerging orthodoxy were declared heretical and subject to destruction. The Gospel of Judas, which offered a radically different interpretation of a key episode in Christian history, became one of the main targets of this campaign. While the official church consolidated its power, an astonishing spiritual current developed in the shadow of its influence: Gnosticism, whose followers offered a radically different understanding of Christ's teachings. Gnostics, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, believed that true salvation came not through faith or good deeds, but through a special, secret knowledge, accessible only to the chosen. At the heart of the Gnostic worldview lay a fundamental dualism, the opposition of the material and spiritual worlds. The material world, including the human body, was considered the creation not of the highest God, but of a lower deity demiurge, often identified with the Old Testament Yahweh. This world, according to the Gnostics, was imperfect, full of suffering and evil, a kind of cosmic prison for divine sparks imprisoned in human bodies. The true God, unknowable and transcendent, was beyond this corrupted world. Between the supreme deity and the material world existed a complex hierarchy of eons, spiritual entities forming the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. In this cosmological drama, Christ played a very special role. For Gnostics, he was not a redeemer of humanity's sins, but a messenger of the highest God, who brought to chosen souls secret knowledge of their true nature and the path to liberation from material captivity. Many Gnostics believed that Christ only seemed human, but was in fact pure spirit. This concept was called docetism, from the Greek to seem. The Gospel of Judas grew precisely from this spiritual soil. In it, Jesus appears not as a suffering savior, but as a cosmic teacher, revealing the mysteries of the universe. And the main recipient of this sacred knowledge is not Peter or John, but Judas Iscariot, the only one of the apostles who truly understood Christ's true mission. Gnostic communities differed from the emerging Orthodox Church, not only in theology, but also in organization. They were less hierarchical, often allowed women into leadership roles, and practiced complex initiation rituals. Instead of public sermons, they preferred secret gatherings where esoteric texts were studied and meditation was practiced. It is especially important that Gnostics offered a radically different understanding of salvation. If, for Orthodox Christianity, the path to God lay through faith in Christ's atoning sacrifice, then Gnostics saw salvation in awakening, the realization of their true divine nature through secret knowledge. Not faith, but gnosis opened the doors to liberation from the shackles of the material world. When, in the early 2000s, scholars finally gained access to the full text of the Gospel of Judas, a narrative radically overturning traditional history unfolded before them. On the yellowed pages of the ancient codex, Judas Iscariot appeared not as a traitor, but as a hero, the only apostle who truly understood Christ's mission. The text begins with a striking statement: the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot during 8 days, 3 days before he celebrated Passover. Already in these first lines, a radical reinterpretation is embedded. Judas turns out to be not a random betrayer, but a chosen recipient of secret teachings. Unlike the canonical Gospels, where Jesus interacts with all apostles equally, here he singles out Judas, taking him aside to impart profound knowledge. "Separate yourself from them, the other disciples, and I will tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. You can reach it, but you will grieve a great deal," Jesus tells Judas in one of the key fragments. Remarkably, in this text, the other apostles are depicted not as enlightened disciples, but as misguided people incapable of grasping the true nature of Christ. When the disciples pray and thank God for food, Jesus laughs at them, saying, "Why do you thank your God? Truly I tell you, I did not come into this world from your God." The confused apostles ask the reason for his laughter, and Jesus replies, "I am not laughing at you. You do this not of your own will, but because through this your God, Demiurge, will receive praise." This dialogue reflects the fundamental Gnostic idea of a lower creator God, distinct from the true higher deity. The most revolutionary aspect of the Gospel of Judas is the reinterpretation of the act of betrayal itself. In the text, Jesus asks Judas for help. "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." These words completely overturn the traditional understanding of events. Judas does not betray Christ, but fulfills his request, helping to free the divine spirit from its material shell. "Your star has risen, Judas," Jesus tells his disciple, predicting not a curse but an exaltation. According to the text, Judas receives not 30 pieces of silver as payment for betrayal, but a vision in which he enters a luminous cloud, a symbol of ascension into spiritual realms. The last lines of the manuscript are concise and dramatic. "And he received money and handed him over to them." But in the context of the preceding narrative, this act acquires a completely different meaning. Not a base betrayal, but the highest service, the fulfillment of a cosmic plan for the liberation of the divine spark from the captivity of matter. Chapter 6 of the Gospel of Judas overturns all traditional understanding of Iscariot's role in the history of Christianity. If for 2,000 years Judas was a symbol of absolute betrayal, the ancient text presents him as the chosen disciple, the only one to whom Christ entrusted his true mission. In this alternative narrative, betrayal becomes a sacred act. "You will surpass them all," Jesus tells Judas, "for you will sacrifice the man who clothes me." Behind these enigmatic words lies a key Gnostic concept, the separation of spirit and matter. According to the Gnostics, Christ's divine spirit was imprisoned in a physical body, as in a dungeon. And Judas, by betraying Jesus to the authorities, was actually freeing his divine essence from material captivity. "Your star has risen, Judas." This phrase from the ancient text completely contradicts the canonical image of the cursed traitor, doomed to eternal torment. Instead of 30 pieces of silver as a symbol of base greed, the Gospel of Judas describes a spiritual reward, a vision in which Judas enters a luminous cloud, symbolizing his own spiritual elevation. What makes this interpretation particularly dangerous for the Church? First and foremost, it destroys the fundamental narrative of Christ's voluntary atoning sacrifice. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus accepts suffering to atone for the sins of humanity. In Judas's version, he seeks to free himself from the physical body, considering the material world not God's creation, but a cosmic error. Such a reading completely undermines the very foundation of Christian soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. If the crucifixion was not a sacrifice for humanity, but an escape from the material world, then what remains of the idea of atonement for sins? If the physical body is not a temple of God, but a prison for the spirit, then how should one regard Christ's incarnation and his bodily resurrection? It is no wonder that Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the first systematizers of Christian doctrine, wrote of this text with such indignation. For the nascent church of the 2nd century, such a reading of the gospel events was not merely an alternative version, but a direct threat to the entire theological edifice. At the heart of Gnostic teaching lies a radically different understanding of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. While traditional Christianity sees Jesus' death on the cross as an atoning sacrifice for the sins of humanity, the Gospel of Judas offers a completely different cosmological drama. According to the Gnostic text, Christ's death was not a sacrifice for the salvation of a sinful world. On the contrary, it is presented as the liberation of the divine spirit from the prison of the material body. That which you see, Jesus tells Judas in one fragment, is not the true I, but only my outer shell. This concept completely undermines the foundations of Orthodox Christianity. If Christ's body is not a sacred vessel of divine nature, but merely a temporary and unwelcome shell, then the incarnation loses its sacred meaning. If the crucifixion is not a sacrifice, but a liberation, then what remains of the idea of atonement? In the traditional Gospels, Christ's last words on the cross, "It is finished," are interpreted as the completion of the mission of salvation. In the Gnostic interpretation, however, these words acquire a completely different nuance, as a cry of the Spirit's liberation from material bonds. Even more radical in the Gospel of Judas is the attitude towards the resurrection. If in canonical texts, the resurrection of Christ in the body becomes the main proof of victory over death, and the promise of a universal bodily resurrection at the end of time, then the Gnostics rejected the very idea of bodily resurrection as meaningless. For the Gnostics, the body is not a temple of the Spirit that will be restored in glory, but a prison from which the Spirit must escape. Salvation, in their understanding, is not the resurrection of the flesh, but its ultimate liberation. "The kingdom of heaven is within you," the Gospel of Judas quotes Christ's words, "but not in these walls of flesh." This concept explains why Judas, in the Gnostic text, becomes a positive hero. By helping Christ free himself from his bodily shell, he acts not as a traitor, but as the most faithful disciple, the only one who understood the true nature of his teacher and his mission. Such a reinterpretation had colossal consequences for understanding the essence of Christianity. If the death on the cross was not an atoning sacrifice, then what is the path to salvation? The Gnostics answer, not faith in Christ's atoning sacrifice, but personal spiritual knowledge, gnosis. This is the main reason why the nascent Orthodox Church fought so fiercely against Gnostic texts. Gnosticism offered a path to salvation that did not require the mediation of the Church. If only personal spiritual experience is needed to reach God, then what is the role of priests, bishops, and church sacraments? By the end of the 2nd century, the escalating conflict between Orthodox Christianity and Gnostic currents reached a critical point. The Church, striving for uniformity of faith and centralization of power, began a systematic struggle against alternative teachings. The main ideologue of this struggle was Irenaeus, Bishop of Lugdunum, modern Lyon, whose name forever entered history as a symbol of opposition to heresies. Born in Asia Minor around 130 AD, Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp of Smyrna, who in turn studied under the Apostle John. This apostolic succession lent particular weight to his theological arguments. Around 180 AD, Irenaeus created the monumental work Against Heresies, Adversus Heresies, more famously known as The Refutation and Overthrow of the Falsely Called Knowledge. In this 5-volume work, Irenaeus first mentions the existence of the Gospel of Judas. They have fabricated a fictitious writing, which they call the Gospel of Judas, he writes. I have gathered their writings, in which they urge the destruction of the works of Ister. By Ister they mean the creator of heaven and earth. For Irenaeus, the Gospel of Judas was not merely an erroneous text, but a direct threat to the foundations of faith. He associated it with the sect of the Cainites, a Gnostic group named after the biblical Cain. The Cainites, according to Irenaeus, exalted all the negative characters of the Bible: Cain, the inhabitants of Sodom, and of course Judas Iscariot, considering them bearers of true knowledge who oppose the unjust Creator God. In his polemic, Irenaeus developed the concept of apostolic succession, which became a cornerstone of church authority. According to this idea, the true teaching of Christ was passed from the apostles to their direct disciples, and then to the bishops of major churches. Any text or teaching not conforming to this tradition was declared spurious. We can enumerate those whom the apostles appointed as bishops in the churches, and their successors down to us, wrote Irenaeus. They taught nothing similar to the ravings of these people. This argumentation allowed for the rejection of alternative gospels as later forgeries, even if they were created in the same period as the canonical texts. Irenaeus's particular fury was aroused by the Gnostic interpretation of the crucifixion. They assert that Judas did not betray Christ out of ignorance, as many believe, but, knowing more than all the apostles, fulfilled the mystery of the betrayal. According to them, through him all earthly and heavenly powers were destroyed. And this invention they call the Gospel of Judas. Irenaeus's strategy was simple and effective. Instead of engaging in complex theological discussions with the Gnostics, he ridiculed their teachings as absurd, presented them in a caricatured form, and associated them with immoral behavior. Thanks to this approach, Irenaeus's work became not only a theological treatise, but also a powerful weapon in the struggle for church unity. The 4th century AD marked a turning point in the history of Christianity. Emperor Constantine, having won the Civil War, attributed his success to the help of the Christian God. The Edict of Milan, issued in 313, ended the persecution of Christians and gave the religion official status in the Roman Empire. But with imperial support came new problems. Now Christianity had to determine which of the numerous versions of the faith would become official. In 325, Constantine convened the First Ecumenical Council in the city of Nicaea. Formally, the bishops gathered to resolve the Arian dispute about the nature of Christ. But in fact, a much broader question was being decided. Which direction of Christianity would receive imperial support? The emperor personally presided over the council, demonstrating that religious issues had now become state matters. I want you all to be of one mind, Constantine declared to the assembled bishops. For the emperor, accustomed to military discipline, the diversity of Christian currents was not a wealth of tradition, but a threat to the unity of the empire. The state needed a unified church with a clear hierarchy, capable of strengthening social order. The Council of Nicaea was the first step towards the formalization of Christian orthodoxy. 318 bishops, representing different churches of the empire, adopted a creed that is still used in Christian worship. Arianism was condemned as heresy, and its followers were persecuted. But the Council of Nicaea was not limited to theological issues. In the shadow of debates about the nature of Christ, the process of defining the canon of sacred texts was underway. Although the official list of canonical books of the New Testament was approved later, it was in the 4th century that a general idea was formed about which texts to consider divinely inspired and which to consider heretical. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the main fighters against Arianism, in his Paschal letter of 367, for the first time listed the 27 books that make up the modern canon of the New Testament. It was this list that was later officially approved by church councils. During this period, alternative Gospels, including the Gospel of Judas, were finally ousted from church use. Texts that did not correspond to the emerging orthodoxy were declared spurious and destroyed. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, who was nicknamed the Christian Pharaoh, persecuted the custodians of non-canonical writings with particular zeal. A key role in this process was played by Athanasius the Great, who wrote, "Let no one add to these books or take away from them." His authority as a defender of the Nicene faith helped to fix the canon and cut off alternative texts. With state support, the Church gained the opportunity not only to preach its version of Christianity, but also to forcibly suppress alternative currents. Emperor Theodosius I, who ruled at the end of the 4th century, issued a series of edicts declaring any deviations from the Nicene Creed to be heresy. In this atmosphere, Gnostic communities, which preserved texts such as the Gospel of Judas, were forced to go underground or flee beyond the empire. Many found refuge in Egypt, where the influence of imperial power was weaker, and the traditions of Hellenistic mysticism created fertile ground for alternative spiritual teachings. When Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, a methodical campaign began to destroy all texts contradicting the official doctrine. This ecclesiastical censorship reached its peak in the 4th and 5th centuries, when bishops, supported by imperial power, declared a real war on alternative gospels. The Gospel of Judas became one of the main targets of this religious cleansing. In 367, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria sent out his famous Easter letter, where he first officially listed the 27 books of the New Testament that comprise the modern canon. In this same document, he warned believers against reading books not included in the canon but appointed by the fathers for new converts to read. A stern prohibition followed. Let no one mention the name of these false writings, created by heretics, who write them when they wish, endowing them with dates, so that, presenting them as ancient, they may have an excuse to deceive the simple-minded. Emperor Theodosius I went even further. In 391, he issued an edict declaring the possession of heretical texts a state crime. Anyone in whose possession a forbidden book, composed by Porphyry or any other heretic against the Christian religion is found, shall be liable to punishment, the imperial decree stated. Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, who earned the nickname Pharaoh, organized special detachments of parabolani, fanatical monks who burst into the homes of those suspected of heresy, confiscated and burned forbidden texts. Many owners of Gnostic Gospels were subjected to torture to reveal the names of other custodians of prohibited literature. In their sermons, bishops called the Gospel of Judas the Book of Satan and poison for the soul. Epiphanius of Cyprus wrote, "These serpents, worshippers of Judas, hold in their hands a book called the Gospel of Judas and claim that he alone of all the disciples knew the truth. But this is not the gospel of truth, but the gospel of betrayal." The monk Shenute of Atripe, who headed a large monastery in Upper Egypt, boasted that he personally burned thousands of heretical manuscripts. In one of his sermons, he declared, "I found books full of poison and death, and I did not spare them, but cast them into the fire to cleanse the world of their defilement." This campaign was so successful that by the 6th century, virtually all copies of the Gospel of Judas and other Gnostic texts had been destroyed. In the Byzantine encyclopedia Suda, compiled in the 10th century, the Gospel of Judas is mentioned only as a vile book, which by the grace of God can no longer be found anywhere in Christendom. The few surviving Gnostic communities were forced to go deep underground or flee beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. Some found refuge in remote areas of Egypt and Sudan. Others migrated eastward to Persia and beyond. It is thanks to these fugitives, who hid their sacred texts in caches and caves, that some Gnostic Gospels have survived to this day. December 1945. Egypt, the vicinity of the city of Nag Hammadi. The peasant Muhammad Ali al-Saman, along with his brothers, was searching for fertilizer for their fields at the foot of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff. None of them could have imagined that this ordinary day would enter the history of world science and religion. Digging through the soft soil, they stumbled upon a large clay jar. Inside were ancient manuscripts, 13 codices in leather bindings, containing over 50 texts in the Coptic language. Thus, the world rediscovered the lost library of the Gnostics, which someone had hidden in a cave some 1600 years ago, saving it from destruction. The Nag Hammadi find became a real sensation in the scientific world. The ancient texts, dating back to the 3rd and 4th centuries, included many previously unknown Gnostic Gospels and treatises: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and many others. This was the largest collection of Gnostic texts ever discovered. The fate of the find proved to be difficult. Initially, local residents divided the codices among themselves, not understanding their value. Some sheets were burned as fuel, others sold on the black market. Only thanks to the efforts of the Egyptian historian Taha Hussein and the French researcher Jean Dorès were most of the texts saved and reassembled. By the 1950s, the main part of the library was in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The significance of the Nag Hammadi find can hardly be overestimated. For the first time in 1500 years, scholars gained access to authentic Gnostic texts, rather than their descriptions in the polemical works of Christian heresiologists. This opened a new chapter in the study of early Christianity. Until this point, understanding of Gnosticism was formed mainly from the works of its opponents: Irenaeus of Lyon, Hippolytus of Rome, Epiphanius of Cyprus. Now the Gnostics spoke with their own voice. The Nag Hammadi texts showed how diverse early Christianity was. Instead of a single church with a clear doctrine, researchers were presented with a picture of many competing currents, each with its own understanding of Christ's teachings. This discovery cast doubt on the traditional view of Christian history as a direct line from the apostles to the modern church. Particularly important was the discovery of complete versions of texts previously known only from fragments or mentions. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, containing 114 sayings of Jesus, many of which are not found in the canonical Gospels, forced scholars to reconsider their ideas about the early Christian tradition. Although the Gospel of Judas was not part of the Nag Hammadi find, it was this discovery that created the context for its subsequent study. When the manuscript with the Gospel of Judas finally came into the hands of scholars in the early 2000s, they already had extensive experience working with Gnostic texts and an understanding of their theological features. The Nag Hammadi find showed that Gnosticism was not a marginal current, but a serious intellectual movement within early Christianity. Gnostic texts were characterized by philosophical depth, poetic imagery, and complex cosmology. They offered an alternative view of the nature of the divine, the origin of evil, and the path to salvation. Unlike Orthodox Christianity, which emphasized faith and obedience to ecclesiastical authorities, Gnostics stressed the importance of personal spiritual experience and secret knowledge. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library had a huge resonance not only in academic circles, but also in popular culture. Gnostic ideas were reflected in literature, cinema, and music. Works such as Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, the Wachowskis' film The Matrix, and even Leonard Cohen's songs were influenced by Gnostic philosophy, which became accessible again thanks to the find in the Egyptian desert. When the ancient papyrus containing the text of the Gospel of Judas finally fell into the hands of scholars in the early 2000s, its condition caused serious concern. The manuscript was a true puzzle, over 1,000 fragments of papyrus, darkened by time, many no larger than a postage stamp. Researchers faced an almost impossible task. First, to restore the physical integrity of the document, and then to decipher and translate the ancient Coptic text. The restoration was entrusted to Florence Darbre, a leading papyrus conservation specialist from Switzerland. Working under a microscope with special tweezers and the finest Japanese paper, she painstakingly joined the fragments for 5 years, as if assembling an ancient mosaic. "Every day I prayed that my hands wouldn't tremble," Darbre later recalled. Thanks to her skill, about 80% of the original text was recovered. Parallel to the restoration, the manuscript was being dated. Radiocarbon analysis, conducted independently in laboratories at the University of Arizona and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, yielded an unambiguous result. The codex was created between 220 and 340 CE. This fully corresponded to the time when, according to Irenaeus of Lyon, the Gospel of Judas actively circulated among Gnostic communities. Analysis of the ink, performed using Raman spectroscopy, showed its typical composition for Egyptian manuscripts of that period: soot with added vegetable gum as a binder. The leather binding of the manuscript also corresponded to the technologies of early Coptic bookbinding. The linguistic study of the text was of particular value. The Gospel was written in the Sahidic dialect of Coptic, a late descendant of ancient Egyptian that used the Greek alphabet with the addition of several demotic signs. Professor Rodolphe Kasser of the University of Geneva, the world's leading Coptologist, confirmed the authenticity of the text's linguistic features. The language, grammatical constructions, stylistics, everything points to an authentic 3rd century document, he stated. Falsifying such a text in our time is practically impossible. Comparative analysis with other Gnostic texts, especially the Nag Hammadi library, revealed striking parallels in theological concepts, terminology, and cosmological ideas. Specific Gnostic terms such as eon, pleroma, archon, were used in the Gospel of Judas exactly as in other authentic Gnostic texts. The final, and perhaps most compelling proof of authenticity, was the comparison of the manuscript's content with Irenaeus of Lyon's description of the Gospel of Judas, given around 180 CE. The key concepts that Irenaeus criticized: the portrayal of Judas as a chosen one who received secret knowledge from Christ, and the interpretation of the betrayal as a sacred act, fully corresponded to the text found. Professor Bart Ehrman, a leading scholar of early Christianity at the University of North Carolina, summarized the research results. "We have no reason to doubt that this is precisely the text Irenaeus wrote about. It is not a forgery or a medieval copy, but an authentic Gnostic document created in the 2nd or early 3rd century. The scientific authentication of the Gospel of Judas was of immense importance, not only for the academic community, but also for a broader understanding of early Christianity. It definitively confirmed that in the first centuries of the Christian religion, various versions of Christ's teaching competed, and the image of Judas as an absolute traitor was not the only possible one in early Christian tradition." The publication of the Gospel of Judas in the 2000s caused a real storm in the Christian world. After National Geographic's sensational announcement of the restoration of the ancient manuscript, church hierarchs of various denominations found themselves needing to react to a text that radically overturned established notions of a key figure in evangelical history. The Vatican reacted with restraint, but unambiguously. Cardinal Walter Casper, president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, stated, "This document is interesting from a historical perspective, but it has no significance for Christian faith. It merely confirms what we have always known, that in the early centuries there were various Gnostic currents that offered alternative interpretations of Christ's teachings." Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams went further, calling the Gospel of Judas a curious historical artifact that, however, adds nothing to our understanding of the person of Jesus or the historical Judas. In his opinion, the late dating of the text, no earlier than the mid-2nd century, deprives it of any historical value regarding the actual events of the 1st century. Orthodox churches reacted more sharply. Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev of Volokolamsk called the text an ancient forgery created by a Gnostic sect to justify betrayal. He emphasized that no archaeological findings can shake the 2,000-year tradition of the Church, based on the testimony of the apostles. However, among theologians and biblical scholars, the reaction was much more nuanced. Professor Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, a leading expert on Gnostic texts, noted, "The Gospel of Judas should not be taken as a historical account of events, but it gives us invaluable insight into how diverse early Christianity was. It's a reminder that the winning version of history is not the only version that existed." Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, emphasized, "We must remember that the canonical Gospels were also written decades after the events they describe, by authors who were not eyewitnesses. The question is not which version is historically more accurate, but what theological ideas lie behind different interpretations." The most interesting position was that of a group of Catholic theologians from the Society of Jesus, Jesuits. Father François Ruffin, professor of patristics at the Pontifical Gregorian University, noted, "The text of the Gospel of Judas forces us to reflect on the complexity of early Christianity and how our tradition was formed. Instead of rejecting it as heretical, we should ask ourselves what theological problems it tried to solve." Representatives of liberal Protestantism took a special stance. Bishop John Shelby Spong, known for his unorthodox views, stated, "The Gospel of Judas reminds us that Christianity has always been a religion of interpretation. A monopoly on the only correct interpretation is a form of idolatry, worshiping not God, but our ideas about him." In academic circles, the publication of the Gospel of Judas stimulated a new wave of research into early Christianity. Professor Karen King of Harvard Divinity School emphasized, "This text is important not because it gives us an alternative history of betrayal, but because it shows how early Christians used the figure of Judas to address the theological problem of evil. If Jesus is omniscient and omnipotent, how can one explain that a traitor was among his closest disciples?" The discovery of the Gospel of Judas in the 2000s had the effect of a bombshell, not only in academic circles but also in popular culture. The ancient text, which overturned the traditional perception of the most famous traitor in history, immediately captivated the imaginations of artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians worldwide. Following the publication of a complete translation of the manuscript by National Geographic, an alternative image of Judas as a chosen disciple, rather than a treacherous betrayer, began to permeate the cultural fabric of modern society. Literature was the first to react. Doby Martinez's novel, The 13th Apostle, became an international bestseller, presenting the story of early Christianity through the eyes of Judas, not as a betrayer, but as the only disciple who truly understood Christ's mission. The book sparked heated debates and was even banned in some conservative religious communities, which only increased its popularity. In cinema, the reinterpretation of Judas's image began with the documentary film The Lost Gospel, which garnered over 100 million views on streaming platforms. It was followed by the feature film The Chosen One, where Judas was depicted as a tragic hero, carrying out a secret mission at the request of Jesus himself. Critics noted that for the first time in the long history of cinema, Judas's image was stripped of demonic traits and shown with deep psychological realism. Visual arts also did not stand aside. The exhibition Rethinking Betrayal at the Museum of Modern Art in New York brought together works by artists from all over the world who presented their interpretations of the newly discovered gospel. Marina Abramovich's installation, 30 pieces of silver, caused a particular stir, where visitors were invited to hold a silver coin and decide whether to return it or keep it, symbolically reenacting Judas's moral choice. In the music world, the rock band Apocrypha's album, The Star of Judas, entered the top 10 conceptual albums of the decade, and the opera Gnostic Visions, by contemporary composer Arvo Part, received a prestigious award for its innovative musical embodiment of ancient texts. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Gospel of Judas on mass culture came through the internet and social media. The hashtag #NotATraitor went viral, generating thousands of memes, videos, and online discussions. The younger generation, less tied to traditional religious institutions, enthusiastically embraced the alternative history as a symbol of the need for critical thinking and a willingness to reevaluate established narratives. Intellectual discussions extended far beyond theological seminars. Philosophers, sociologists, and cultural theorists saw in the story of the Gospel of Judas a powerful metaphor for discussing broader issues about the nature of historical truth, the mechanisms of collective memory formation, and how victorious ideologies rewrite history, demonizing their opponents. Professor of Cultural Studies at Columbia University James Robinson notes, "The case of the Gospel of Judas became a perfect illustration of how cultural memory works. For 2,000 years, Judas's name was synonymous with betrayal, not because we know exactly what happened, but because the victorious version of Christianity needed that image." The discovery of alternative narratives forces us to consider how many more such obvious truths are actually the result of ideological construction. Psychologists paid attention to how easily the mass consciousness accepts simplified binary oppositions of hero-villain, and how difficult it is to introduce more complex, ambiguous interpretations of historical events. The image of Judas the betrayer is so deeply rooted in the collective unconscious of Western culture that its reinterpretation evokes an almost instinctive resistance in many people, even non-religious ones. History is not merely a collection of facts. It is a battlefield where various versions of the past contend for the right to be considered truth. When we speak of the Gospel of Judas and other lost texts of early Christianity, we confront a fundamental question. Who gets the privilege of telling the story? And what happens to the voices of those who lost in this struggle for historical memory? For 2 millennia, Western culture has perceived Judas Iscariot solely through the prism of betrayal. His name became a byword, a symbol of absolute treachery. But the discovery of an ancient manuscript revealed that another version existed, a version in which Judas was not a villain, but a hero, the only disciple who truly understood Christ's mission. This discovery has significance far beyond the narrow field of biblical studies. It reminds us how our collective understanding of the past is formed. The victors write history. This ancient wisdom finds vivid confirmation in the fate of the Gnostic Gospels. When one branch of Christianity received state support in the 4th century, alternative voices were not merely silenced, they were methodically destroyed, declared heretical, demonized. And this is not a unique case. Across the world and throughout all ages, we see how dominant groups shape official narratives, marginalizing and erasing alternative perspectives. From colonial histories that ignore the perspectives of indigenous peoples, to political regimes rewriting history textbooks, the mechanism remains unchanged. The return of lost voices, like the Gospel of Judas, is critically important for modern society for several reasons. Firstly, it is a matter of intellectual honesty. We cannot claim a complete understanding of the past if we ignore entire strata of historical experience. Secondly, it is a matter of justice towards those whose voices were forcibly silenced. And finally, it is a matter of our own self-understanding. We live in a world shaped by victorious narratives. Our values, Our ideas of good and evil, hero and villain, are deeply rooted in the stories we absorb from childhood. When we discover that these stories are only one of many possible versions, it opens up space for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the human experience. The Gospel of Judas reminds us that history is rarely black and white. Behind every demonized villain, another story may be hidden. The story of a person acting according to their convictions, their understanding of good. Behind every canonical text stand dozens of rejected alternatives. And it is in this polyphony, not in a monolithic official version, that we can hope to find a fuller understanding of our past.